Well, thanks very much for putting the conference together today. It's fantastic. I very much enjoyed the talks and discussions so far, and I'm looking forward to another whole day of them. Peter Petrovsky's theoretical work has been hugely influential on my own thinking, so it's a real honor for me to be here today at this inaugural event. East Germany ceased to exist as a country in 1990, a fate shared by other Eastern and Central European countries like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia in subsequent years. Whereas those countries remained in Eastern Europe, albeit with different names and borders, East Germany was absorbed into the Federal Republic of Germany, which effectively moved the dividing line between Eastern and Western Europe approximately 320 miles to the east. This meant that East Germany not only disappeared as a country, but its people were now located geographically in the West. As such, it's frequently left out of studies of Eastern and Central European art. Contributing to this elision is the relative lack of East German voices in scholarship after 1990, the result of German unification, which was not the coming together of equals, but rather more closely resembled an annexation by West Germany, which was 5 times the size of the East. In the wake of unification, many East Germans were deprived of their jobs, left unemployed after factories were shut down, or in the case of university professors and heads of museums and art schools, dismissed as having been corrupted by the communist system and thus having no place in the new Germany. As Jürg Rösler wrote in Der Freitag earlier this month, the transition to capitalism in Eastern Germany was more brutally carried out than in other Eastern Bloc countries because East Germany made up only 1/5 of the German electorate. This meant that those in power did not have to soften their approach to maintain power. In countries like Poland, in comparison, those in power implemented neoliberal changes more slowly or risked being voted out at the next election. The expulsion of scholars from leading positions in academia has led to a rewriting of East German art from a Western or victor's perspective, one filled with Cold War and neoliberal biases against the former socialist country, formed from nearly 40 years of Cold War rhetoric, in which each Germany presented itself as the better Germany and presented the other Germany as the inheritor of the Nazi past. As a result, even when scholars of Eastern and Central European art do include East German art in their studies, they can unknowingly repeat these biases and thus inadvertently reaffirm the very center that horizontal art history intends to disrupt. In my paper today, I will begin with a case study from current scholarship to show the impact of secondary literature on our understanding of East German art. I'll then outline what I see as the 4 main stages of Western reception of East German art, before turning to a number of questions and observations I have with regard to current scholarship and the relationship between East Germany and other Central and Eastern European countries that I hope we can discuss afterward. Ultimately, I'll argue that the only way to write a truly horizontal art history is to recognize and overcome the Western biases still at work in scholarship on Eastern and Central European art, and that to do so necessitates that we do primary research rather than rely on secondary literature, at least with regard to East Germany. For my case study, I'd like to focus on Peter Petrovsky's representation of the East German artist Hermann Gluckner in his 2009 book, In the Shadow of Yalta. My intent is not to criticize his work, but rather to show how, even with the best of intentions, a reliance on secondary literature can lead one to reaffirm Western views. I began by reading a condensed version of Petrovsky's text with asterisks following inaccurate points that I will address in more detail afterward. Quote, almost the only East German artist who in the 1950s and 60s preserved and continued to develop the modernist tradition was Hermann Gluckner. Gluckner had a tremendous prestige among members of the so-called independent art circles in the GDR, which may account for the fact that he was entirely ignored by the state and its official cultural institutions. His work only began receiving serious attention in the 1990s after his death. Gluckner is a constructivist who does not have any real opportunities to construct, an experimenter who cannot expand or disseminate his experiments, end quote. The first point I'd like to challenge is the idea that Hermann Gluckner was almost the only East German artist who in the 1950s and 60s preserved and continued to develop the modernist tradition. This idea fits within the first level of reception on East German art that I will sketch out in more detail later, the one that tends to think that East Germany didn't have art, just political propaganda and kitsch, which is often seen as synonymous with socialist realist works based on the Soviet model. Yet this type of painting reached its peak in East Germany in 1953 at the Third German Art Exhibition in Dresden with works like these two, which were highly praised in the press for their realism and optimistic approach. In the wake of Stalin's death in March 1953 and the workers' uprising that June, however, artistic policy in East Germany relaxed, and many artists began engaging more publicly with modern art. In the mid-1950s, as Petrosky himself noticed, Picasso was the focus of much discussion with regard to his relevance for East German artists, a discussion that appeared across multiple issues of Bildende Kunst, East Germany's official art journal. During these years, artists in Berlin, like Ernst Schröder and Harold Metzges, were creating dark works inspired by the Parisian avant-garde. In Halle, the Gallery Hennig exhibited modern works by local artists including Billy Sitte and Joachim Heuer. By the mid-1960s, artists in Leipzig like Werner Tübke, Wolfgang Matheuer, and Bernhard Heisig were creating modern works inspired by expressionism and magic realism, works that, although controversial at the time, would later come to represent East Germany and the West by the late 1970s. Now, of course, there were freezes and thaws throughout these years, so what could be created and exhibited changed depending on when and where, yet it becomes clear that Gluckner was not one of the only East German artists who worked in the modernist tradition in the 50s and 60s. The second point I contest is the idea that Gluckner was entirely ignored by the state and its official cultural institutions, that his work only began receiving serious attention in the 90s after his death. This statement fits within the second level of reception on East German art in the West, the myth of the repressed or dissident artist, and stands in sharp contrast to the facts. In the immediate wake of World War II, Gluckner exhibited with the Dresden Group Der Ruf, as well as in the first two national German art exhibitions in 1946 and 49, and a number of official district exhibitions between 1946 and 52. In the mid-50s, he exhibited paintings in both East Germany and West Germany, but his rise to relative prominence first began in 1969 with a major solo exhibition to mark his 80th birthday. This was one of the first of at least 12 solo exhibitions of his work in East Germany in the 70s and 80s. In addition to many catalogs, he was also the focus of 2 monographs, more than 50 articles in newspapers and journals, and a documentary film, all created in East Germany, most before his death in 1988. He also received several awards, including the National Prize of the GDR. Gluckner was thus hardly an artist who was entirely ignored by the state and its official cultural institutions. There is nonetheless some truth embedded in the statement. Gluckner was not as well known or supported as so-called state artists like Bernhard Heisig and others of the Leipzig school. This is in part because Gluckner focused on his own work rather than engaging in the art world as a teacher, cultural functionary, or jury member. While one might be tempted to interpret this lack of engagement in terms of repression, Gluckner was, in fact, a very solitary figure by nature. As he stated it in his autobiography, quote, "All I did was work. I hardly had any connection to other colleagues or friends. My wife and I, we were almost always alone," end quote. This is how he described his life, not in the GDR or even the Third Reich, but rather in the 1920s. Similarly, others who knew him pointed out his modest and hardworking nature. The East German art historian Lothar Long wrote in 1975 that Gluckner was, quote, "a quiet man who valued his distance," end quote. For Gluckner, creating art was what interested him the most, not engaging with the larger art world. The ability to focus solely on his art was a choice he had because he lived in East Germany, where unlike in the West, artists did not need to take up other jobs to support themselves financially. They could live as full-time artists. Now, there was a period of time when Gluckner did not exhibit in East Germany, the 10-year period from 1958 to 67, but these were not years of inter-emigration. Gluckner continued to create murals with his wife, something they'd been doing together since 1925 and would continue to do until her death in 1968. He created 3 columns for a new building of the Technical University, or TU, in Dresden in these years, and he took part in an international sculpture symposium in West Germany. The third point I'd like to contest is the idea that Gluckner was a constructivist who did not have any real opportunity to construct. Gluckner fulfilled at least 2 commissions for public art in addition to his many murals. One of these is the massive 30-foot-tall sculpture now in front of the TU in Dresden. Initially commissioned in 1975, this work took nearly a decade to complete and required the coordination of multiple agencies, including metalwork, transportation, and installation, and cost more than 30,000 marks. Gluckner himself received 10,000 marks for it, which was enough to pay for rent for more than 4 years in the 1980s. Petrovsky's presentation of Gluckner as a repressed artist stems from his reliance on secondary literature and falls primarily into the second of what I see as 4 levels of understanding or engagement with East German art, each of which is more open than the previous level. And I'd like to now briefly sketch out these levels before returning to the problematic of relying on secondary literature. The first level is the idea that East Germany had no art, just political propaganda and kitsch. This is the common view in English language scholarship, where East German art is frequently excluded from overviews of German art, and that's all the way until 2009. An important example of this is the 1986 exhibition at the Royal Academy of Art in London, with the inclusive sounding German art of the 20th century, but had no East German art. It was also a common view in Germany after unification and can be seen in a number of major exhibitions, culminating in the rise and fall of the Modern exhibition in 1999, which placed Western art in one building, an art museum, and East German and Nazi art together in another building, not an art museum, and ultimately treated the Nazi art with more respect. East German works were hung salon style and without organization on a plastic tarp, as can be seen in this photo in the bottom right, and notice also the plastic lawn chairs for viewing. But East German art's exclusion is not limited to temporary exhibitions. This art, and especially those works best known in East Germany, tends not to be visible in the permanent collections of museums anywhere in Germany, including in the East, which has outstanding collections of such work. This relative absence of visibility is the result, in large part, of the fact that most leading positions are held by Western Germans, who, if not dismissive of East German art, are at the very least unfamiliar with it and thus unlikely to engage with it. This is a prime example of what Spivak calls sanctioned ignorance, and reflects the fact that after 1990, many Eastern Germans were purged from their jobs, replaced by Western Germans who were seen as more qualified and politically more suitable. Even today, nearly 30 years later, most of the directors of major art institutions, including in the East, are from Western Germany. The second level of approach to East German art is the idea that art could be created in a dictatorship, but only by alternative or dissident artists. This focus on so-called dissident artists often suggests that these artists rejected and were rejected by the socialist system. In reality, however, there were very few dissident artists in East Germany. Many of the artists singled out as such for praise, such as Lutz Dombeck and Hans-Hendrik Grimling, were in fact members in good standing of the official artists' union. This membership gave them access to materials, and more importantly, the ability to spend their time creating the very art that today is being praised as being against the system. This second level of engagement with East German art, with its emphasis on so-called dissident or alternative artists, came to prominence in 2009 with several exhibitions marking the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It stems in part from the West's desire to see itself as the better Germany, together with a belief that style is an indicator of political persuasion. Yet a closer examination of these works reveals that performance, installation, and abstract art did not necessarily reflect a rejection of socialism or an embrace of the West. Indeed, many of these artists saw East Germany as the better Germany, albeit in need of reform, so they did not reject socialism, but rather wanted to expand its definition of art, some actively, others in simply wanting to pursue their own interests. Much secondary literature in Germany today falls into this level. In 2016, for example, Christoph Tanner curated a major exhibition in the Martin Gropius Bau in Berlin titled Gegenstimmen, or Opposing Votes, the very title of which lends itself to being understood as an exhibition of artists who were against the state. The third level recognizes that even so-called state artists could create art of value to the West, at least using Western standards, but suggests that they were somehow separate from or critical from the East German state. As such, this level engages with the complexity of the art itself, but suggests it was unrelated or in opposition to the East German context in which it was created. This view can be seen in the catalog for the 2009 LACMA exhibition, Art of Two Germanys, which is really the first to include East German art on a major exhibition in English-speaking world. It can be seen in this catalog when one of the curators stated incorrectly that canonical East German paintings like Tübke's Life Memories of Dr. Schulze must have been an unofficial work that had passed undetected through the censors. Similarly, the 2005 exhibition of Bernhard Heisig in Germany presented him as a victim of two dictatorships and downplayed the fact that he was a politically active artist who was not only committed to socialism, he was also director of the prestigious Leipzig Art Academy, vice president of the Artists' Union at the national level for many years. Presenting him as a victim was presumably an attempt to distance him from the East German state and thereby recover him for a Western audience steeped in Cold War ideology. It's also an example of epistemic violence of contemporary scholarship. More recently, this third level can be seen in the Behind the Masks Artists in the GDR exhibition at the Barberini Museum in Potsdam, which closed earlier this year. This exhibition showed more than 80 artists from all walks of life in East Germany, from highly praised artists like Heisig and Tübke to those who ultimately left the GDR in the 1980s like A.R. Penck and Cornelia Schleimer. Yet, as the title of the exhibition suggests, it presented all of these artists as working somehow separate from or in opposition to the East German system. The fourth and final level of scholarship on East German art attempts to understand this art on its own terms and without moral judgment. This more nuanced view of East Germany is most commonly achieved by scholars working outside of Germany. A recent example is the 2016 exhibition of Werner Tübke's work in the city of Zwolle in the Netherlands. This exhibition focused on Tübke's art with a minimum of political commentary, allowing the works to speak for themselves and showing that Tübke was an outstanding artist whose work transcends its time. Unfortunately, the exhibition did not travel to Germany. This exhibition raises the issue of geography in terms of East German art's reception, with the periphery able to see these works more clearly than the center. But these peripheral locations also have less of an impact because of their location outside of Germany, which continues to dominate scholarship about East German art. The role of geography can also be seen within Germany, where some of the best exhibitions on East German art are those in out-of-the-way places like Cottbus and Frankfurt-Oder, while those in the center, like the Gegenstimme exhibition in Berlin, remain problematic. And I should say here that there is really good scholarship done in Germany, but these works tend to be harder to find if you're not an expert. So when I criticize the secondary literature, I'm criticizing many of the biggest names, the ones who dominate current scholarship and and are the ones in control of the biggest exhibitions and projects, usually getting federal funding. It's their work that non-experts naturally turn to, and their dominance not only makes their work easier to find, but suggests it's the best that's out there. Peter Petrovsky promoted a horizontal art history, one that engages with the different semiotic and ideological spaces of Eastern Europe and challenges the hierarchical approach of the center-periphery model. He offered an example of what this might look like for Eastern and Central Europe in his book, In the Shadow of Yalta. Yet, as I've shown, his reliance on secondary literature inadvertently resulted in a reaffirmation of Western misconceptions about East German art. This is not to argue against pursuing comparative analyses and overviews, but rather to emphasize the importance of doing primary research for ourselves, at least until a reliable base of secondary literature has been written. For East German art, that's going to take at least another generation, if not 2 or 3, because of the deeply politicized nature of the art's reception since 1990. Yet time is something that scholars today have increasingly little of, as neoliberalization of academia increasingly insists on productivity as measured by quantity. A question I have, and was very much hoping to have the opportunity to address in various conversations this weekend, is to what extent are the issues that I struggle with unique to Eastern Germany, and to what extent are they shared across the Eastern Bloc? I tend to think that Eastern Germany is unique because, unlike other countries in Eastern Europe, they've since disappeared. That have since disappeared. It was not only colonized by the West, its own people were largely stripped of their voices. I also wonder to what extent the current funding situation in Germany today is the same in other Eastern and Central European countries. In the United States, while it might be difficult to get a tenure-track job, such jobs nonetheless do exist, and those that have them are able to pursue their own research agendas relatively independently of external funding. In Germany, in comparison, many art historians are freelance contractors and thus dependent on satisfying the dictates of the commissioning body, which tends to be Western German. One of those bodies is called the working through of the East German dictatorship. So as you can imagine, there's a particular view that they're expecting. Now, this explains something that I had struggled for years to understand. How is it that major scholars in the field can evidence a nuanced understanding of the material in private conversations and even in public discussions, but then publish deeply problematic texts? If one's reliant on external funding, one is cognizant of the expectations that come with that money. Another problem is the tendency for scholarship in Germany today to be dominated by museum catalogs rather than monographs. These catalogs are not only beholden to the larger political imperatives of the day as publications of major cultural institutions, they tend to be written on commission by a number of different authors. Now, I don't have a problem with museum catalogs in general and think they can be a great way to open up new approaches, but they do need to be balanced by in-depth monographic studies. Catalog texts tend to be shorter and are often written in response to external stimuli, a commission. They're also rarely subject to much external or peer review. Often curators are just happy to have enough authors, at least when it comes to East German art. And indeed, when it comes to East German art, authors sometimes have little background in the material, which results in a rehashing of Western stereotypes guised as the latest scholarship. This lack of training can be seen on a larger scale in the Behind of the Masks exhibition at the Barberini earlier this year, which was highly praised as a politically neutral engagement with the topic because one of its curators had been born after unification. The assumption was that she grew up in an ideologically neutral environment, which of course was not the case. Moreover, she didn't have any background in East German art and thus had to learn the material and prep the exhibition in just over a year's time, which is of course not enough time for any topic, let alone one so deeply misunderstood as East German art. This funding situation and the contingent nature of academic employment in the humanities is increasingly becoming the norm even in the US, the result of the neoliberalization of academia, which raises major issues with regard to our discipline in the future. As art historian Julian Stallebras has argued, neoliberalism rewards theoretical approaches because once one has command of that approach, he or she can apply it to any number of objects and churn out articles fairly quickly. Empirical work, on the other hand, and by this I mean primary source materials like archives and interviews, take more time, as does engaging with unknown or challenging objects, works that do not fit easily within Western understandings of art. I've also noticed a tendency among some scholars to look down upon those of us doing empirical work as if we're not somehow theoretically informed, which of course is not the case. To skip straight to theory for a topic like East German art, however, tends to reify rather than challenge Cold War misunderstandings. The focus on theory to the relative exclusion of empirical research thus privileges those artists and art worlds for which the basic empirical studies have already been completed. In essence, it reasserts the West. Thus, again, the importance of doing primary research if we want to understand the very different art worlds of Eastern and Central Europe on their own terms rather than through the distortions of a Western lens. Or at least, it's important when it comes to East German art. I very much look forward to hearing if this is also a problem with other countries in Eastern and Central Europe. Thank you.